If you ever at all thought of FNAF theories, you probably thought of the most recent ones revolving around security breach. I'll hop on it too. However, have you ever thought about how theories were in the early days of the series' lifespan? Well, my dear viewer, they were some of the most insane things you probably ever heard of, but at the time, they didn't seem so far-fetched as they would probably now. Well, you're in luck, because today I decided to reopen the box and take a trip down memory lane and look at quite possibly the most insane pieces of FNAF's history. So what a better place to start than with game theory?
Hello once again, theorists. Welcome to Matpat Plays. Today we are playing the scariest game of all creation. Probably never heard of it. It's called Five Nights at Freddy's.
The very first FNAF theory by Game Theory, titled The Game Theory, Five Nights at Freddy's Scariest Monster Is You, had a very important influence that has since led to the construction of the theory space we've seen today. But the theory itself is quite a questionable piece of media. Obviously, it's already been more than 9 years since its release, and actually it wouldn't have even existed if it didn't win the poll deciding if Matpat would make a Slenderman video or a FNAF video. The content of the video discusses what is in FNAF 1 for the first portion of it, which is primarily about the missing children. However, further into the video, it gets into the really f***ed up territory if I'm being honest. Matpat theorized that Five Nights at Freddy's 1 was an allegory for an actual tragedy that occurred at a Chuck E. Cheese in December of 1993, and had used the people from the incident to connect each one of them to one of the FNAF characters in the game. He also had connected the security guard, who was Mike Schmidt, to be the murderer who was stuck in a nightmare since the building appeared to be abandoned, and managed to get access to the back with a spare mascot costume, and the reoccurrence of It's Me was the acceptance of the fact that the person we played as was the killer. Now obviously I don't have to say how insane all of that sounds, but at the time Matpat did genuinely do a decent job of covering this theory, even if the allegory idea was so wrong. Did he have to compare it to real world murders? No. Did he get some things right as far as the story of FNAF 1? Yes, kinda. However, what we can fully agree upon was the fact that this video did age so poorly. But this was definitely a nostalgic rewatch. But going back to community theories, after FNAF 3, everything truly starts to pick up, but let's just take a quick peek at FNAF 2, since there absolutely was some silly nonsense that I personally believed almost 10 years ago. Obviously, not anymore, but if you remember when people talked about Withered Foxy's jump scare saying freedom, then yeah, you're probably shivering in your boots when that massive lore drop. So around the time the FNAF 2 trailer released, for some reason, people heard freedom from the jump scare sound effect, which is obviously untrue, but at the time this was mind-blowing. And for some reason, misinterpreting audio is really a big issue, because people also theorized that Mangled was trying to call the cops on you since you could hear police codes in a distorted static. More specifically, 10-1, which was thought of because of the phone guy mentioning the criminal database, hence the assumption that they were attempting to call the cops on you. But which is beyond hilarious, but since this was early FNAF, anything was really on the table. Speaking of Mangled, actually, there was a reoccurring thing where Mangled and Toy Chica on multiple different occasions have had really funny theories attached to them. First one was mistakenly seeing a part of Mangled as Toy Chica's beak, so it was theorized that Mangled somehow went out of their way to steal her beak and just left it shoved into her dismantled body. I kid you not, that's all the theory was. But also for some reason, one single frame of Toy Chica and Mangled together in Cam 07 was assumed to be Toy Chica holding Mangled's head and trying to move into the parts and service room to rebuild them, under the assumption that Toy Chica was basically carrying them all around the establishment in order to rebuild Mangled, and was also considered to be puppeteering because of this. Now if you were at all confused by what I just said, don't worry, you're not alone. This one honestly didn't seem so far-fetched at the time like most of the other theories being said, but once the game released, it was instantly debunked as per usual. But let's talk about one that I'm pretty sure most of you will definitely remember or have heard of by now. Mike Kill All. If you reverse the FNAF 2 trailer's opening sequence with their Bonnie, London Bridge is falling down would be playing, but for some reason people heard Mike Kill All, the killer is out, and this is enough when it was reversed. And you know what? It absolutely could sound like it. However, since this song literally has nothing to do with FNAF at all, it just came down to being a coincidence and also was a misinterpretation of reversed audio. Now, what's notably different between FNAF 2 is that we were back to actually being on the right path with the lore this time. However, obviously not completely. Now, if you've noticed, I failed to mention Sparky from FNAF 1. Well, firstly, that's because he was a hoax. However, this time, more specifically AP Gaming from what I saw, theorized that a really blurred drawing of what can assume to be Foxy looked like a really fucked up deformed dog that probably resembled Sparky the dog. The drawing you're seeing here is from an Epic Gaming video about it, and it's as real as Chrome Freddy. However, with the FNAF movie releasing recently, Sparky does technically exist now for real. But if you really want an iconic theory from around this time, the name Salvage should bring back some memories. Around the time FNAF 3 was first being teased, we got got our first look at Springtrap, who was still nameless, and also for the most part unknown as to what he would look like. So people thought about inverting the image to create what we know now as Salvage, and was theorized to be a Golden Freddy variant of sorts, because of the similar facial structure to that of Golden Freddy. And on a completely side note, as an honorable mention before moving on to FNAF 4, I would like to bring up the theory of Springtrap moving through the sewers. Okay, so basically this one doesn't really have any ground to stand on besides the usage of water dripping in the FNAF 3 troll game for some reason, which led people to think of Springtrap being able to travel through the sewer system. Otherwise, this was really as strange as the theories for FNAF 3 got, surprisingly, unless I missed like a ton of them somewhere, but for the most part, this game was pretty straightforward in a sense. When you think of FNAF 4 and theories, you most likely associate it with Matpat's most famous theory, Dream Theory. This was the biggest thing at the time because of the hype surrounding the game, since it was considered the final chapter, which if it isn't obvious is untrue now. Dream Theory was the idea of everything from FNAF being a dream that happened from the bite victim being stuck in a coma because of the incident from Fredbear's, and it all occurred before his eventual demise. Scott has helped guide Matpat into this direction, providing 3 different teasers, which say, in the FNAF 4 minigame, why would the tiny toy Chica be missing her beak, and what is seen in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child, and finally, the famous quote from all of this 4 games, one story. Everything literally tied together almost perfectly, especially if you pay close attention to the details in the minigames before the bite occurs, and also some of the events from previous entries as well. However, if this theory did actually end up being the true conclusion to the series, a lot of the stuff that has happened since then would not exist right now. So let's be happy or not happy, depending on how you see it, that the series didn't end then. Other than that, this theory was quite silly. As for everything else in FNAF 4, did you know there was a time that people considered Nightmare Freddy Spring Freddy because of his design similarities from the teasers compared to Springtrap? Well, that's one of many smaller theories that were discussed around the time frame. However, I'd like to bring up a theory that caught my eye specifically, which is auction theory, where it's basically that FNAF 4 happens directly after the events of FNAF 3, and the idea is that someone bought the animatronics from the auction after the FNAF 3 fire, and instead of playing as bite victim, you play as a completely different child who's being haunted by the bite victim, whose soul is attached to all the animatronics and props from the FNAF 3 auction. Now, obviously, if you're a hardcore FNAF theorist or friends with a couple of them, you might recognize this soul being attached to different props and animatronics as agony. However, this time, this is so far-fetched it couldn't have worked, but obviously taking into account nowadays, some concepts from that theory you might still see floating around. But that specific theory as a whole is pretty much dead. So now we finally reached Sister Location. This is basically where the entire idea of the out-of-this-world theories really start to die down. So I'm going to focus primarily on the big and outlandish theories from around this time period, more specifically adult theory, which is a big example of one. So let's start with that. Adult theory was the idea at its most bare bones that the Sister Location was an adult themed location designed for, well, adults. I'm gonna try and explain all of it in YouTube friendly terms from here, but the entire theory is heavily based off the fact that the location we go down is designed to be really unsafe for children, and would, in a sense, make sense that it's designed for adults because of this, which includes exposed wires as a sort of example. But also using the animatronics in this location, such as Ballora, and discusses her clothing and movements, along with questioning the name choice of Baby, and heavily looking way too deep into the voice lines from the trailer, which was used as more evidence for the theory. It was basically trying to show that maybe we're looking at it from what the animatronics went through this time, instead of what they did to people and their involvements of the murders. Closer to the end of the Reddit post, the final piece of evidence that was used is the timetable from the source code that was found on the scottgames.com website that was seen as booking the animatronics for all the funny stuff that was being applied in the theory. I don't really have to say how insanely wrong this theory was, but this was quite possibly the most infamous theory in this fandom that has ever existed, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you haven't heard about it up until now. But it definitely has a big part in FNAF's history so far because Scott literally had to deconfirm it quickly. Now for the big grand conclusion, I would like to talk about Mike Victim. For multiple reasons, this one is really controversial, but I think it's been long enough, and it's also something I personally wanted to talk about for a while. But the most basic explanation for it is that Michael Afton was the bite victim all along. And to be fair, it absolutely did have evidence for it way back around Sister Location's release, and it would have explained a lot using the evidence from the theory. Why the Fredbear plush states he was going to put the crying child back together, and came back as a robot child who then survived every single inconvenience that could have stopped Michael in his path, and kept being able to come back, which would have explained a lot of the original 4 FNAF games. However, nowadays, and like I mentioned earlier, a really controversial theory for a reason, this really does sound far-fetched, and personally, I don't agree with it, but that might not be the case for some of you, and that's totally fine. But a good portion of the FNAF theorist community, as far as I've seen personally, has agreed that this theory is insane, and has apparently been debunked for a while now, especially after the release of Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, using the Snapbot Afton family table, and also various other contradictions that would go against my victim as a theory nowadays. And with that concludes our journey down memory lane. I personally myself did agree with some of these theories way back in the day when they first came about, but I was also just a very dumb child who enjoyed the funny bear game, so it makes sense as to why. But now that I've grown up, yeah, these theories were just batshit insane if I'm being honest.